Hello everyone, so I'm Dr. Sam Hurst and I'm going to be giving you a brief introduction on how to write a conference abstract. Now, a couple of caveats here. First, I'm not a guru of abstracts. I'm somebody who's written a lot of them and also somebody who's read a lot in preparing for conferences. So this is a brief guide with some top tricks and tips. Secondly, I want to make sure that you realize that there are sort of some limitations to a workshop like this. Different fields and different national traditions have different ways or requirements for writing abstracts. So I am based in Britain, I'm a British academic, and I'm also based in the humanities, specifically literary studies. So it might be that whatever country you're in or whatever field you're in has slightly different requirements. This is a general guide, but please also listen to whatever advice you have been given in your field or by your institution when you're writing abstracts if it differs from this. So first of all, perhaps we should ask, what is an abstract for those of you who don't know? Very simply, it's you writing in, giving a brief summary of the talk that you want to give at a conference. You would reply with an abstract to a CFP or call for papers. Now, this is an example of an abstract, and I'll put the link as well in the video description so that you can click on it yourself. But the first part of preparing an abstract is carefully reading that CFP and making a note of some of the following characteristics. So what kind of abstract length is it asking for? Now, you might find them asking for a very short abstract length, like 150 words, up to something like 500 words. And that abstract length can give you a sense of how much detail they're wanting. 150-word abstract is wanting a very brief summary of your key points. A 500-word abstract is looking for something a little bit more detailed, probably more demonstration of your engagement with the field and your knowledge about what is going on, previous arguments, etc. It's also looking for a more detailed laying out of your own theory or thesis. A normal abstract length will be somewhere around 250 words, and that's what this talk is really going to be concentrating on. You also want to note the bio specifications, i.e. who is it looking for here? If this is a conference which is open to undergraduates and postgraduates, and you're a professor, obviously it might not be the right conference for you to apply to. Similarly, you want to check whether the conference is accepting people outside of academia, whether it's accepting undergrads, whether it's accepting postgraduates, mid-career researchers, etc. So you can find that information, or you should be able to find that information on the CFP. You also want to look at the conference focus. Now you can look at the conference title for this, as you might see from the link. The conference is about the supernatural and witchcraft in belief, practice, and depiction, but also look at the broader description of the conference. Think about what fields it's interested in receiving papers from. This is an interdisciplinary conference, and I've mentioned fields like history, anthropology, religious studies, and literature. It will also give you a sense of what areas or what subfields the conference might be particularly interested in receiving information about, or topics that they are particularly interested in hearing a panel or a SimCall paper on. There might be a mention of a methodology or approach which is of particular interest to the conference or which is not of interest to the conference, and so do make a note of that as well. It should have information on the paper length. A standard paper length for a conference would be 20 minutes, but you might also have the opportunity to apply for a lightning talk or similar, which is 10 minutes. And there'll be information as well as whether you can apply as an individual or whether you have to apply as a panel. Now, both of these options are great. Usually you can apply either as an individual or put a panel together. Putting a panel together means contacting two, usually other academics or experts in your field, and putting together a proposal together. So you have three papers which connect to each other either in relation to theme or approach, for example. Putting together a panel can be a really good opportunity to make sure you're not put on a panel where you're with two other papers that have really nothing to do with what you're talking about. And so you can put together a panel which is going to create interesting conversations. However, it's still more usual to put forward an individual application. There'll also be suggested topics, which goes in with the idea of conference focus, but there will often be a list of specific books or texts or approaches or moments or events that the conference is looking for. So do check there to see if you fit it in and make sure that you bring that out in your abstract. You'll also want to see if there's contact information and whether queries are welcome. This can be a good sign, and it is a good idea to contact the conference organizer ahead of time if you're not sure whether your paper fits in with the conference focus or whether your bio specifications fit in as well. When there is contact information and for queries specifically, it's also a good sign that this conference is going to be open to a wider range potentially of papers and of people applying to the conference from a variety of backgrounds or different academic stages. Now, let's get to the abstract itself and what you will want to see in it. There's a variety of sort of groupings of information that need to appear. But before we get into that, I'm going to briefly show you an abstract of my own. Now, this isn't a perfect abstract, don't worry. Do feel free to rip it apart, but it gives you an idea of how these things might fit together. And hopefully, as we look at it, you'll be able to see what kind of aspects I'm bringing out, and then we can return to this slide and just go through it in a more itemized way. So this was a conference paper of mine to a specific conference which was interested in theology and in fantasy. So you do need to have a look at whether your conference is a generalist conference or on a very specific subject. That will also give you an idea of how you can pitch your paper, whether you can just launch straight into specialized terms or whether you need to give a little bit more background. But let's have a quick look at the paper that I've put together and what information I've decided to include and how I've formatted it. So I'm a big fan of the two-paragraph approach. The first paragraph gives a bit more of a general introduction to the theme and to the topic and the ideas that I'm going to be dealing with. So in this introduction, I talk about the author, William Godwin, and some of his more famous works and the approaches which have been used to assess his works. Because I'm a Gothic scholar, I'm particularly interested in his works which are connected to the Gothic. So give you a moment here, you can pause the video and read the abstract and then come back and listen to me talking about it. In this first section, I make sure to give an introduction to the topic, but also to start mentioning ways in which the texts that Godwin has written have been assessed or interrogated in the past. In this way, I'm showing an awareness of the critical field and also placing my own work in relation to it. I'm suggesting the difference here that I am highlighting between my work and other people's work. In other words, I am looking at this text in a theological bent, and I'm noting perhaps what is unique about the text and what will be potentially unique about my approach. The second paragraph is going to extend on this in much more detail. I place myself in the connection with the field, showing a familiarity with a variety of scholars. This might be even a little bit too much information. I don't necessarily need all those names, but I've expressed more clearly here what the difference is between my work and that which has gone before. So how I'm both connected to it and developing from it. So instead of taking a philosophical approach, I'm going into a much more in-depth theological examination of the text. The methodology that I am using is reading St. Leon alongside Godwin's own theological or anti-theological writing. I'm then differentiating between the work that's already been done on the theology in Godwin, which is often connected to a reevaluation of his relationship to Calvinism, and telling that I am going to be addressing a different theological framing based on necessitarianism and Unitarian theology. So all of that might not make a great deal of sense to you if you're not in the field. That doesn't matter. Don't worry about this. This is for a specialist conference, and so I have pitched it at people who are already familiar with the field. So it's quite a good example of how that might work. The last thing, and perhaps the most important thing to note, is that at the end of that second paragraph, I have very clearly laid out what my thesis is for the argument that I'm wanting to make. So let's have a look at that itemized list of characteristics of the abstract. You can always come back to this and see and assess whether I've actually done what I've said it does, or what I'm about to say it does anyway. So what did that abstract include, and what should our abstract include? Well, first of all, you should demonstrate an awareness of the state of the field. People reading your abstract will want to know whether you've actually done the reading, whether you've engaged with knowledge in the field. Now, it depends where your expertise is coming from. If this is a conference like the ones that I run that welcomes expertise from other backgrounds, this doesn't need to be a demonstration of the state of the field in academic writing, but more broadly about the discussions ongoing in your field of expertise. However, you should make some reference to existing work and existing criticism or critics. This can be done in greater detail for a longer abstract, or in passing for a shorter abstract. You also basically need to show awareness of common or existing arguments. I need to know that you know what you're talking about and that you've thought about this in connection with other people, rather than just this being your first thoughts about the subject. You should also in some way recognize or acknowledge a research gap or produce a challenge to an existing field, saying where does your work fit in, how is it adding to what already exists, or what is it challenging about common conceptions of the field, for example. So you may be offering a methodological approach which is different. For example, my work is based on historicized theology, and that's often the difference between my work and other people's. One thing you want to avoid, though, is being overly confrontational. It's never a good idea to start your abstract with the vibe of, I know better than everybody else in the world. Even if you do. It's just not the best of looks, and it can be quite combative and overly confrontational, and doesn't show that you're engaging in discussion, but rather that you're just kind of wanting to talk over the field. So the next thing that you need to give is a brief outline of your argument. So you might mention key sources. These might be critical, particularly if you're mentioning a specific methodology, but they also should refer us back to the text that you're interrogating if you're talking about books or films, as I will often be doing. Finally, you want to give a very clear statement of the central thesis or conclusion. Now, when you're writing this, you need to think about who is going to be reading the abstract and who is your audience for it. Now, for many people, the last line of my abstract would be incredibly dull, potentially. If you're not in the field, you're not interested in the writer, or you're not interested in the intricacies of 18th century theology, which, fair enough. But my conclusion was pitched towards a specialized audience. If you've got a more general audience, you want something that's going to be a bit more catchy and pick up a wider degree of interest that can appeal to perhaps non-experts in your specific field reading the abstract. But basically, you need to let us know in this thesis statement of sorts why we would want to hear your paper. What is the argument? What are you going to be saying? What is the reason that people would attend this paper at a conference? So there are a couple of common mistakes that people make in writing abstracts, and it's worth going through them quite quickly and noting them. Now, you might be able to think of some others, but these are the ones that came to mind for me. The first is tone. We've already talked about an overly combative tone, but you also want to avoid being too colloquial and general in your comments and not demonstrating sufficient sort of engagement with the field or gravity in your arguments. That doesn't mean that you can't have a bit of fun in your abstract. You definitely can. But maintain a fairly formal tone which isn't too aggressively combative, or if it is giving a very clear justification for that approach if you're calling out an injustice in the field, for example. You want to be careful about form. I prefer the 2-paragraph format with a more general introduction, talking about the field, and then a sort of laying out of my own argument. That doesn't have to be used, but try to avoid a mega paragraph, particularly if it's a 500-word abstract, for example, and try to avoid using too many short paragraphs or single sentence paragraphs. It wants to be a clearly structured abstract as well, just as it would be for any other piece of work that you're doing or submitting. With the length, make sure that you have looked at and kept to within about 50 words of the suggested length on the abstract, on the CFP, sorry, because that length is a clue to the type of abstract they're wanting. If you've written a 150-word abstract for a 500-word call for papers, you're not going to be giving them the information that they want. You need to give an exhibition of expertise. This is the thing that most people forget, I think, or is the easiest thing to forget. You need to show that you're aware of the field. I need to know that you're not just having your first thoughts about this, particularly if it's a popular topic. If I get the impression from reading your abstract that you think you're the first person to have thought, for example, that Carmilla is a lesbian vampire, or that Dickens was writing about class, I'm going to question your expertise in the field. And it could just be a question of you not writing it up well. So don't let that happen. Give an exhibition of your expertise. Show how you know where you place yourself in the field, that you know the field, that you know common arguments, and that you're engaging with them. You also want to make sure that you're giving a clear argument, that you have to have that thesis in there somewhere. I have to know, what are you actually going to be saying? What are you going to be talking about? And what is going to be new about your paper? What is the point that you're going to be making? Tied to this is the issue of lack of information, that sometimes people don't include details of the methodological approach, for example, if they have a very important one. If they're using, for example, a psychoanalytic approach or a historicized approach, I need to be able to sort of see how you're approaching the question from the abstract. Some people won't put the name of the book or the author or the historical figure, or they sort of gloss over information which is obvious to you perhaps as somebody deep in the field, but might not be as obvious to somebody reading this abstract for the first time. So don't make the mistake of leaving out key details. Now, one of the things that you want to think about for a conference paper and an abstract is, of course, the title. So when we're writing our own abstract, that's where you're going to start. Now, I've got 4 titles here, and take a second to pause the video and to think about which ones you like the best and which you think are going to make the best impression at a conference. So welcome back from your pause. These are all conference titles that I have made up. I would never use an example from real life of other people's work. That would be very unethical. These are all ones that I have made up, related in part, I will admit, to the sort of interest I have in the text, one of the texts that we're celebrating at our conference this year. But if you're anything like the people who've come to the live workshops, you'll have noted that number 2 and number 4 are perhaps your favorites. The others fall into some common errors. The first, well, there's just no detail, is it? This is a conference on witchcraft and you've just called the paper Witches. I don't know what that's about at all. No, nor will anybody else looking at the conference schedule. That it's not going to appeal. It's not going to draw people in, and it doesn't give me an idea of what you're talking about when I'm going to be reading your abstract. The third one, so many words, too much information. It can be really tempting to use a really long quote or a very, very detailed title, but do try and step away from that because it overwhelms and it's just too many words and it becomes unclear. Also, this is not a good quote that I chose. If you're going to use a quote, keep it short and snappy. The final one feels a little bit too broad again. This is the kind of heading that you might get for an edited collection chapter rather than a 20-minute paper. It's not bad, but it's still a little bit broad. The second one was one of people's favorites in the live classes. That 2-part title is very popular in the humanities, particularly in literary studies and particularly in Gothic studies. You can get some really dramatic titles going in Gothic studies, and we do love a little bit of that. So do feel free to send me a great title if you're ever applying for one of my Gothic conferences, which goes a little bit over the top. Love it. But in this, it's quite clear from the title that I'm talking about witchcraft depiction. And there's also a clear theming, history and spectacle, in relation to a specific book or text. That's fine and very helpful. In the fourth one, there's a use of a short quote, The quote itself is quite snappy and does quite a lot. I curse thee witch is an interesting juxtaposition to what we might expect. It's witches who curse, right? But here we're thinking about ecclesiastical curses. So the quote works well with the title, which it doesn't really in the third example. So 2 and 4 are probably the best models, but make your own decisions about what works for you, and also be aware of your field. In the Gothic and in horror studies, you can get away with some very overdramatic titles. It might be less certain in other fields. Before you start writing your abstract, remember to work out what is your thesis, what is your argument, and that will be the basis for everything that you're going to then write, which includes talking to me about, telling me about how your work fits in with the rest of the field, what's new or unusual about it, and telling me the basics of what your texts are, or what is your methodological or critical approach going to be. So just to summarize what I would like to see from your abstract and how I would suggest structuring it, but I'll go back to the but in a second, is I'd like to see the state of the field, a clear research gap or where you are adding to or challenging something in the field, an outline of your key or basic arguments, and then your very clearly written and summarized argument or thesis. I would recommend using the first 2 points in your first paragraph and the second 2 in a second paragraph. But as you could see from my example, that can be a little bit fluid. I put more of the research gap in the second paragraph. Also, this is just a recommendation. That's my but. This is what I prefer to write, and I think it works well as a sort of basic structure. But it depends on the argument that you're presenting, what you're presenting, what field you're presenting it to, what type of abstract you're writing, how specific it is. For example, if you're writing for a very specific audience, you're going to need to show more knowledge of the state of the field, and it might incorporate itself in both the first and the second paragraphs. So this is a basic guide, a basic introduction, a basic set of suggestions. If you do have any questions, do feel free to put them underneath the video and I'll get back to you. And I also do offer a service for free every month where if you have an abstract that you would like to send in and get some feedback on, I can do a couple of those every month for people. And people have found that that can be quite helpful. Even if I'm not the world's greatest expert, I am another set of eyes, and I can help point to difficulties that you're having in expression, or areas where, for example, a generalist not in your specific field is going to stumble or fall when reading your abstract. So I hope this has been helpful, and please do get in touch. I'll put a contact email in the description if you have any questions or if you would like to send me an abstract. So thank you for coming, and goodbye.